as we look at where we are today, I want to say I could not agree more with the comments that former Chair Jenny Yang made about what is going on today. And all of this work and how we make change really is about tiles of a mosaic where each of us plays a part and puts down tiles, and it is over time that we are able to literally change the picture through these small actions which are cross-sectoral. And were it not for the tenacious, consistent, dedicated work of Representative Story, we wouldn't have had this bill. But in order to change mindset and to build what I would say is critically important and never more so, certainly in my lifetime than today, is how do facts match our narratives? And that the work of the center being established creates the democratization of fact so that individuals all throughout the United States and certainly beyond will be able to use both the particular facts, which will be revealed and evidence-based and replicated here, to then look at those models, to apply those same models both at sort of the local, provincial or state, and then nation-state level. In many ways, and Fidan's work has been incredible, and it's been a total pleasure working with Dawn and being part of one of the EEOC DataNet conferences, but to begin to understand all these different levers. And as happens historically, one rarely begins making change at the national policy level. And how fortunate we are to live in a democracy where we literally have our cities as labs of innovation. And given the extraordinary length of time that it took to actually make change, and note that change doesn't take place because a law takes place. Change takes place because all the different levers across the ecosystem begin to be pressed and build momentum and narratives as well as facts, and outcomes for people begin to change. And to the point of how it is that people see themselves in that story and that narrative. Nobody makes change because you tell them that they're wrong or tell them that they're bad. And at this point in time, while we're looking at issues of diversities, and really in my view, it's always issues of both justice and issues of dignity, how do we take our facts and build models which can be replicated and used that change narratives in a way that people can see themselves within that? And to understand that equal pay for women isn't about the individual who is or is not discriminated against, about the female. That what it's about is literally creating opportunity for families, creating an economic engine that fuels for all people the communities, the provinces or state and the nations that they live in. It's about putting dollars back on Main Street where women spend more of their dollars and so forth. To that end, we created something which was referred to earlier because we could not get a law passed, but we also couldn't sit idly by. And when a law is passed, particularly one that focuses on discrimination, unless someone has the wherewithal to understand what they've experienced with discrimination, then has the ability, the knowledge, the language capacity, the resource of time and so forth to then file, that it's then filed whether it's here at the state level or the federal level and moves forward, and you saw the outcomes, right? Long road, pretty subdued outcomes. But when we change what a business does, when we create in behavioral sciences what we would call a nudge, the life of the employer and the outcome changes today. And we need both. We need all these different mosaics and levers. So when Mayor Menina was mayor, I had gone to a doctor's appointment, was reading the paper in the waiting room, and they had the State of the City speech. I'm an active participant in political life. I read the speech. Somewhere in there, there's several paragraphs that are evidence-based, research-oriented language. And I thought, my goodness, it sounds just like they're reading off our song sheet. I go in for my appointment, and I don't think much more about it. 3 days later, I get a call from a woman named Catherine Lusk, who runs the city's initiatives at Boston University. And she had been one of my students. She had just graduated. She's at BU now, but then was a newly minted graduate of Harvard's Kennedy School. And she says, I'm working with the mayor. And I said, pray tell, might you have had a light touch in the speech? And she said, I did. We're trying to figure out what we can actually do. And a set of business leaders, at the time only women, and it's now expanded to be inclusive, were convened, and they brought me not as a business person, but as someone who understood the data to figure out what could we do. And the idea was, let's do something that can help every single woman in the city of Boston who lives or works there. Let's focus on closing the wage gap. Through a variety of actions, and we understood also, because AIM was not particularly engaged. And simultaneously, I was chairing the Commission on the Status of Women and Girls for the state, and built a 5-year plan, which inevitably took 6 years. But what I understood was we had to change the ecosystem, and that we had to rebuild how people saw themselves in these narratives. And that rather than trying to pass a particular piece of legislation, my dream was, how would we create, through the Women's Commission and the system of women's commissions across the state, the opportunity where the new normal in Massachusetts, and certainly in Boston, would be that people would elbow themselves to get on the stage when something good was happening for women. And to really understand that every person, every leader of an organization, and the major employers needed to understand, why did this matter? And to compete in our global world in the 21st century, if you can't manage your talent well and retain your women employees, who, by the way, when people say they're leaving for family reasons, within 18 months, what the evidence shows us very clearly is they're working for a competitor, that you need to have an efficient model in your organization. And paying women fairly is efficient. And I had the joy of also sharing with the leaders of many organizations, including the one that you had mentioned, when they say, well, what will it cost our members? I say, if it costs your members a dime, you're telling me they're currently breaking the law. And everyone says, And we created an evidence-based white paper, right, which all of you're familiar with, the idea of like, what are 33, and there are many more, but key interventions that employers could use to help close that wage gap. We worked with an organization called the Hariri Institute to use data, and it's not anonymized because it's never known, so it has the equivalent research capacity as anonymized data, where employers could sign on to this compact called 100% talent. Remember, again, something's in it for everyone. It wasn't called something about women. It wasn't called something about diversity, where each and every person and employer could see themselves in this, and that they would have the opportunity to sign the compact, to share their data in this way that it would never be revealed, and to commit to taking 3 interventions that they would do inside their organization. But to socialize this idea, we began at the top rather than the middle. So Kathy Minahan, who'd been head of the Federal Reserve and was over at the Simmons School of Business, Evelyn Murphy, the first woman to ever win statewide office here in Massachusetts, was the other co-chair, and a woman named Allison Quirk from State Street. And we went and talked with a mass competitive partnership, it used to be called the Vault, with the largest employers, and we knew if we could get a few people who headed these major organizations to say, yes, we're for it, we were going to begin to change that ecosystem. And John Fish from Suffolk Construction, Partners, Mass Mutual, Staples, and so on, began to say, we're invested in this because it's good for business. And simultaneously, we're doing all of this wonderful work in a very large coalition on how can we get the Mass Equal Pay Bill Act. That political working coalition is without my Harvard hat and in my spare time. And what we have done by taking in this data from these different employers is we now have 16% of Boston wage earners in this data set. So for the first time that we are aware of in the history of the United States, we have employer-reported data whereas census data is individual reports. And note, if you think about how people self-report, there could be a gendered effect. If one was going to say how big the fish was that they caught, you may have a difference in how men and women would want to portray the size of the fish that they caught. And so for the first time, we can actually have a sense. Now note, this study, right, or this information, organizations opt in to being part of this. It may be likely that the organizations that choose to opt in may feel more comfortable on what their gender wage effect is. We, of course, worked with the EEOC. What categories should we ask them to report in? And we literally mirrored the EEO1 form. So we, in essence, had a very sort of soft, I would say non-scientific survey or ability to try this out. And I say that because we couldn't randomize, because businesses could opt in, and it wasn't done legislatively. But by doing it this way, we now have employer after employer after employer, 16% of the whole workforce now in an organization that is proactively trying to get it right. I think that nothing could be more important than having the actual data. My view is there is no problem that as a society we cannot solve if we can measure it. But you cannot solve a problem that you can't understand and you can't see where the edges are. No edges, no data, you never know which lever is working or not working. So nothing could be more important than the work that you're doing here. We are just thrilled to have the opportunity to work with you, to amplify what you're doing, to share it with others. I'm hopeful that we'll see a change on that. And we're always looking for additional partners and those who want to be engaged, either in the work of the Women's Workforce Council, which is the Boston group that works with these companies. Mayor Walsh, of course, took this on as well. But thank you for what you're doing. It's an enormous contribution, and we all can't wait to see what comes of it. Thank you.